Hello, my name is Vanna, and this presentation is a report back from a Witness for Peace delegation with the focus of faith, economics, and Cuba-U.S. relations that I was a part of in September of 2016. Through this delegation, I came to appreciate the unique ways Cuba has structured its society, as well as the challenges many Cubans face. I also saw parts of U.S. history through the eyes of a neighbor and identified current opportunities to promote peace, justice, and reconciliation. I'm currently living in southern Texas, and when I look across the Gulf, I know Cuba is there. Just last fall, I was walking with a couple of friends along the Malecon Boulevard in Havana. Then, looking out across the water, I knew the U.S. was there, but amidst the people of all ages and skin tones, dancing and hanging out on what is called the couch of Havana, it seemed far away. We kept walking along the Malecon, and all of a sudden the people thinned out. Across the street was the U.S. Embassy. The stillness and silence around it said a lot. We got a taxi ride back home from a young man out of university. He was one of the many well-educated taxi drivers I met, others being historians, professors, and medical professionals. Tourism pays more than the government salaried positions, and it pays in the tourist luxury CUC currency rather than the Cuban peso used for more staple items. We arrived at where we were staying, the Martin Luther King Center, affiliated with the local Baptist church. It was founded on the theology of liberation and popular education and promotes community leadership and dialogue. The center hosts educational delegations as a part of its sustainability. Each day we got up early, and sometimes we could join in sorting beans, a skill I was quite slow at. We would eat breakfast of coffee, fruit, rolls with butter, cheese, ham, and a hard-boiled egg, a specialty item not easily accessed. Then we'd get ready for the meetings of the day. Our delegation consisted of 19 members from different parts of the United States, an interpreter named Eloisa, our Witness for Peace coordinators, Kat and Ray, and our skillful bus driver, Jose Luis. Witness for Peace's mission is to support peace, justice, and sustainable economies in the Americas by changing U.S. policies and corporate practices that contribute to poverty and violence. Witness for Peace is only present in countries that request its presence, and it began sending groups to Cuba in 1999 to document the effects of the economic blockade and the travel ban. Our delegation had a specific focus on faith communities. Through speaking with a variety of faith leaders as well as a government representative, common threads arose. In the first 2 decades following the revolution, the government seized unused church properties. However, it never interfered with active places of worship. It did prohibit religious institutions from being involved in education. It also prohibited people of faith from being in government or high-touch professions such as teaching, counseling, and medicine. This changed in 1992 when the Cuban Constitution was amended to reflect a secular rather than an atheist state. Many faith leaders emphasize that currently faith communities are revitalizing the idea of community within a socialist context, where the initial sense of community that was created following the revolution has waned. Faith communities are caring for a growing elderly population, bringing people together in service, and now the government is actively encouraging faith leaders to continue to promote these values. There was also concern voiced from many faith leaders about a new wave of churches preaching prosperity gospel along with neoliberal political agendas. They also stated they would like to be more involved in the education of children, which continues to be restricted. This is a picture of a ceremony at the house of a babalao, or a practitioner of the Santeria religion, that was brought over by enslaved people from Africa and continues to be widely practiced in Cuba. These are 2 pastors who shared about their missionary work in Cuba, and one of the pastors who was on our delegation from the U.S. A Catholic Mass we attended, and a synagogue we visited in Havana. We also learned about Cuban history and social context. On our first day in Havana, we had a tour with a history professor. Cuba was originally inhabited by the Guanahatabe, Siboney, and Taino indigenous groups. The first Spanish city of Baracoa was created in 1511. By the mid-1800s, Cuba continued to participate in the enslavement of African people and was the lead producer of sugar in the Caribbean. In the late 1800s, Cuba abolished slavery and gained independence from Spain. The middle image is a statue of José Martí, one of the Cuban revolutionaries in the War for Independence. A highlight of our delegation was speaking with a group of churchwomen who participated in a Cinco Ballet dance group together. They were children when the revolution occurred and spoke about their lives before and after 1959. One woman shared about how she remembered living in poverty as a child, and after the revolution she was able to access education. Eventually, she became an architect. She notes that in many other places, including the United States, this would have been very difficult or impossible for a Black woman of her generation. The women talked in detail about their ration booklets, or libretas, for food and basic goods, the contents of which had become more and more scarce since the fall of the Soviet Union. However, all of them emphasize that even with the current scarcity, they are better off now than under the Bautista regime in power prior to the revolution. Multiple women also shared with enthusiasm and pride about being a part of the literacy campaign that occurred in the years following the revolution. A woman named Beatriz fondly remembered her time, staying with a rural family, helping them with farming during the day, and teaching them reading by candlelight at night. In this way, Cuba eradicated illiteracy in 1 year, and with good universal education, it currently maintains a literacy rate of upward of 99%. We spoke with a family doctor who described the neighborhood model of providing universal health care in Cuba. She does yearly home visits to families and assesses health status as well as environmental health factors and nutrition. She says medicine is often hard to access due to the U.S. embargo. There is universal prenatal care, and maternity leave is 1 year, and Cuba achieves maternal and infant outcomes similar to the United States with fewer resources. Cuba also trains and exports doctors to serve around the world. Public health announcements were common in the streets. We visited an artist collective that was funded by the state where high school graduates from rural provinces do intensive residencies in art, music, theater, or dance. They do workshops and collaborative artistic projects in rural communities to help expand access to the arts. We visited the rural province of Ciénaga de Zapata, where the Bay of Pigs is located, and contrary to Google Maps, the trip was actually 4 to 5 hours. I came to understand the Bay of Pigs invasion in a broader context of Cuba-U.S. relations. After independence from Spain, Cuba experienced U.S. occupation and then control through the Platt Amendment, which asserted the right of the U.S. to intervene in Cuban politics for, quote, preservation of life, property, and individual liberty, end quote. Preservation of property being key, as U.S. business interests controlled over 40% of the sugar industry, 50% of the railway services, and 90% of the telephone and electric services by the mid-1920s. In the first half of the 1900s, the U.S. backed both democratically elected governments as well as military dictatorships such as the one in power prior to the Communist Socialist Revolution. Many U.S.-owned businesses and properties were taken over by the Cuban government at that time. In 1961, the U.S. began implementing trade restrictions that were further codified in the 1990s with the Helms-Burton and Torricelli Acts. These meant no remittances going back to Cuba, ships that had been to Cuba couldn't go to U.S. port for 6 months, fines were in place to disincentivize any kind of business with Cuba, including international business, the restriction of food and medicine shipments, no individual travel to Cuba, and no export of Cuban goods, services, or goods to U.S. market. We call this legislation the embargo. Many Cubans call it the blockade. In addition to trade and travel restrictions, the U.S. supported and allowed acts of terrorism towards the Cuban government and civilians, such as the bombing of Cubana Airline Commercial Flight 455 that carried the entire national fencing team. Knowing the impact that 9/11 has had on our experience as Americans, I can only imagine what it would feel like to have terrorism arising from such a close neighbor. In 1961, the U.S. backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was defeated. This poster says, after the Bay of Pigs, all the people of the Americas were a little more free. Slightly ironically, this museum portraying the militarized struggles of an underdog revolution reminded me of the revolutionary dynamics of the American Revolution portrayed in the musical Hamilton. People were putting their lives on the line to work towards a cause they believed in. While there may not have been democratic elections, there was widespread popular support for the revolution within Cuba initially. This describes the context of rural areas prior to the revolution, context I'm familiar with from travels to other parts of Latin America. Extreme poverty, coal is the only source of economic income, widespread illiteracy, high rates of infant and child death due to malnutrition and parasites, only 2 bus lines as means of transport. This poem by Nicolas Guillen, a poet and activist contemporary of Langston Hughes, captures the revolutionary sentiment in the museum. It reads, multitudinous blood. When the soldier, dying for his homeland, writes Fidel with his own blood, don't say what a pity. This blood is a symbol of the homeland that lives. When his voice is in pain, tongue seeming as if it can no longer express itself, don't say that he is silent, for the words of the homeland resound. When his body falls, lifeless, in the land that covers him in his ambition, don't say rest, for the homeland still stands, shining and working. Now no one will be able to stop his heart, for it is connected and shared. Don't say that he is gone. His multitudinous blood is one with a homeland that remains. We were in Cuba for the anniversary of the creation of the Neighborhood Revolutionary Defense Committees. This celebration entailed big soup cookouts on each block with people dancing to different kinds of music on the streets. On this day and in general, it was inspiring to see the socializing and community building happening in public space. During the delegation, we also participated in Cuba's growing private sector. 19% of GDP is private, and 23% of employment is private. Cubans can buy and sell property. This sign says house for sale. Cubans can rent rooms in their houses as small B&Bs called casas particulares. And there's a growing number of private restaurants, or paladares. I left Cuba feeling that I had visited not a utopia nor a hell. The city of Havana and the rural areas we visited seemed free from the abject, heartbreaking poverty I've seen in other Latin American countries. At the same time, people seemed weary of the daily hustle for things like food or transportation, which were there but less than desired. Everyone we spoke with, no matter their political perspective or thoughts on the current government, emphasized that the blockade felt like an act of violence and was damaging to everyday Cuban people. They all asked for our support and advocacy to change this policy. One journalist thought the blockade made it so the Cuban government could justify more restrictive policies based on a self-protection argument. He ventured that if the U.S. stopped acts of aggression towards Cuba, there could be more support for true self-reflection in Cuban society. A recent poll indicates that the majority of Cubans living in the United States also support the end of the embargo. Ending the blockade is a bipartisan issue. This is a list of current legislation to open relations with Cuba, sponsored by both Democratic and Republican representatives. I have included the links for this legislation on this YouTube page. And if we follow this link to the Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act, we will go to congress.gov and we can click on the list of co-sponsors. Scrolling down, I see that there are no co-sponsors from Washington State, so I've contacted my representatives to ask them to support this bill. I've also contacted my senators to ask them to support the Senate counterpart. There's also the Cuba Trade Act of 2017 and its Senate counterpart, and the Cuba Agricultural Exports Act and its Senate counterpart. Please consider taking a moment to contact your representatives and ask them to support this important legislation to open relations with Cuba. Witness for Peace continues to lead delegations to Cuba as well as to other countries in Latin America. While I'm living on the U.S.-Mexico border, I've become more aware of the many young people fleeing Central America from violence left by a legacy of U.S. military involvement. I'm grateful for the work that Witness for Peace is doing to shape more humane and collaborative U.S. policies in Latin America. Please consider donating to Witness for Peace or traveling with them on a delegation. MEDIC is an organization promoting healthcare collaboration between the U.S. and Cuba. And Cuba, What Everyone Needs to Know is a wonderful book with more information about Cuban history. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it.